Right. Hello, everyone. Everyone, welcome back. Let's continue with our session today. Let's now welcome to the stage Professor Barry O'Sullivan, who you all know very well. He is the head of assessment research and development at the British Council. And let's also welcome Nick Saville, Director of Research and Thought Leadership at Cambridge Assessment English. So welcome and thank you for your presentation. So whenever you want.
Hi, Barry.
Hi, how are you doing? I'll just share my screen.
Hi, everybody. Greetings, in my case, from Cambridge, UK time here.
In my case, from Dublin, as it happens. That's where I am right now.
Same time zone, I think, Barry.
Same time zone, exactly.
Here it's just time for a cup of tea. But then when isn't, if you happen to be in England?
Well, we've just watched Ireland struggle to beat Japan in rugby, so we're a little bit calmer now than we were an hour ago, I'll put it like that.
Looking forward to the rugby later, and then the football, of course. So, yes. Shall we kick off? Shall I start, and then you join me?
Yes, why don't we do it that way?
So
I'll organize the slides. You just tell me what you want me to do.
Okay, so so my name's Nick Saville. I'm from University of Cambridge Assessment English, and I work with Barry and the team on IELTS research. So here's a little interesting title, I would say, comparing tests. Is my mojito your mojito? Why this title? Well, I guess we don't need to introduce mojitos to a Latin American audience, but just in case there are those listening from other parts of the world, this is a popular cocktail that originated in Cuba, I think, a country renowned for its rum and the quality of its rum. So ask yourself before we start, what goes into a real Cuban mojito, or perhaps your favorite version of this recipe? Personally, when it comes to cocktails, I prefer margarita, but that's another part of this story. And I hope the relevance of comparing cocktail recipes will become obvious a bit later on as we go through the talk. But we have a confession to make. We have to come clean on this. We do like this metaphor, but we actually borrowed it and this as a title from our old friend Piet van Avermaet. Some of you may know Piet. He's now the head of the Center for Diversity and Learning at the University of Ghent, where he teaches multilingualism in education and language policy. And I guess those things are also relevant in this consideration today, if only marginally though. Piet first used this title, I think it's nearly 17 years ago, November 2004, at an ALTE conference that I'd helped to organize in Bilbao, Spain. Piet was then responsible for the Dutch language examinations at the University of Leuven. And I think, Barry, you were also a speaker there in another life.
Yes, I was.
Talk about, was it business English perhaps at the time?
Probably was, yes.
But the main focus at that conference was on assessing regional and less widely used languages like Basque. And we just begun our work in Europe on the manual for aligning examinations to the CFR, which had been newly published in 2001. And Piet was representing ALTE on the authoring team. So in a nutshell, we were focusing on comparability using a common framework of reference and considering the limitations of comparability when things are different both by nature and by design. And by nature, I mean, how do you compare language proficiency outcomes in Basque versus French? Can language skills be aligned to a common framework if they're different languages? And if so, how and what are the implications for assessment? That's what we talked about. But then there's also by design, in another way, how can you compare different assessments of the same language using a framework of reference? So in what ways does my French exam compare with somebody else's French exam, for example? So is my B1 French certificate equivalent or in some way the same as your B1 certificate? Well, there's the issue. It can't realistically be the same as we've deliberately made them different. So how different can they be and still be comparable in meaningful ways? Hence Piet's metaphor to get us thinking. So let's look again now at the Mojito in order to return to these issues, because I think they're highly relevant today. So here we have 3 highball glasses that look more or less alike, but there are 2 recipes using the classic 5 ingredients of Mojito. But spot the differences between these 2. Have a quick look across the screen. And you'll notice that there are some differences. The ingredients are the same, but there are changes which could be according to taste or how alcoholic you want to make it. So I hope you agree with Pete's point. Mojitos can be different and still be mojitos. So can language teaching materials or examinations be different, but still be aligned to the same point? But yes, when is a mojito no longer a mojito? Look at this last example of a recipe. Still looks alike, but what's the difference there? Can you see? Yeah, well, it's vodka, not rum. You could call it a vodka mojito, but for the purists, that's no longer a mojito, is it? So the main point here is that before you make the comparison and agree that it's different, it's the same, you have to look at the issues which are also different, and that's to do with the ingredients. So I guess this takes us to our point. So let's now get a bit more serious when we start thinking about this. So compare. 2 comparisons here, one that works and one that doesn't. Why doesn't the one work at the top? It's all down to the ingredients. And this analogy can be taken across when you have a whole array of things you look at which are claimed to be the same, which could be the case in a whole array of language tests. So Barry, what's the array that you've got there?
Well, we can just refer, you've already actually said all of this stuff. The difference is mojitos can be different and still be mojitos, but if the differences are major, then there's a problem. We can say the same about how we interpret the CEFR. Now let's get serious about it. So thanks, Nick, for that. Here are a bunch of language tests that are out there in the world and commonly used nowadays. Just a few, to be honest, a few that I could find easily online and get my images onto the screen when I was doing it. But I know all of these tests quite well. They're all good in some ways and not so good in other ways. Some of them are wonderful in all kinds of ways. Of course, I would always say that about tests I'm involved with myself. But when we think about this, we know when we look around the world of language tests and the use of language tests, that there are all kinds of comparisons made. And it's not unusual to find comparison tables around the place. These are just 2 that I found online when I was preparing this, but there are literally hundreds of them. Often organizations make their own, often ministries make their own. But I always ask myself, how do they do it? What methodology did they use to come up with this? And generally, it boils down to a small number of methods. Number 1, there's none. People at an institution simply look at what others have done and copy it without actually understanding what they're copying. That's a serious problem. There's another problem in that people look at the content and have a quick look at the content of 2 tests and think, well, these are pretty similar. You know, they look like they're testing the same thing. So, you know, these are equivalent. I can make claims about that. Another big problem, of course, we have is measurement. People just look at the test scores and say, oh, wow, you know, I have scores. I've got 100 students who've taken this test and another 100 have taken that test. Therefore, I can just compare them. And I see that as a massive problem, because looking at it either by content only or measurement only means that we're limiting what we can say about the tests when we make any kind of a comparative judgment. So the argument that I will make and Nick will make today is that we need to look at both sides, because really when we think about the construct is actually operationalized through the content and the measurement at the same time. So when we do a construct analysis of a test, really we should be looking at both. And that's the reality. It's a position that we have taken over the years, and it's a position that we will continue to take, that we will not publish comparability studies that don't look at both sides, because we don't believe it tells you the whole story. And there's a few good reasons, I think, for that. So we reject the first three. We say that the last one is the way to go. We have to look at both sides. So let's take an example of good practice then. Recently, myself and a bunch of other people took part in a really interesting study where we looked at a comparability or equivalence, if you like, of the IELTS and the Pearson PTE academic test. There have been some reports out which compare the two tests, but which have taken different perspectives. At least one which has looked at the content, and at least one from Pearson themselves that has looked only at the measurement. So we thought, well, the best thing for us to do is to go back to the drawing board and basically do what we claim other people should do, do the right thing. So let's see what we did. Actually, we had the project had two elements to it. The first element was an independent construct comparison. That's what we called it at the time. I probably wouldn't use the construct comparison anymore, because I think nowadays we think more of the construct as being the content and the measurement. But the idea being that we try to look at how the construct might be operationalized in the test. So what are the different tasks in the tests doing? So what kind of linguistic challenge do they cause? What kind of cognitive challenge do they entail? So we try to look at the test from those perspectives. The point being, we're kind of comparing the Mojito recipes, if you like. We're saying, are these two tests close enough to each other in terms of how they operationalize the underlying language construct to even allow us to move to a phase 2? And I think that's a critical area that we have to think about when we make comparisons across tests. Should we be doing it at all? If the tests are so wildly different that they don't appear to be testing the same thing, should we be testing them? Should we be comparing them? It's very obvious to me that we shouldn't. Now, this is not a new idea. I was using this idea back, I think it was 2009. I did a CEFR linking study for what was then some tests for I think they were Pitman or one of these. I can't remember now. The old brain is gone. But I did a study where I looked at the language level of these tests. They were City and Guilds, of course. And I realized right from early on that unless you do this sort of construct analysis of the test first, there's no point in going on to the later stages of claiming an equivalence between the test and the standard. Because if it's not there in the first place, why go to all the trouble of setting up all of these expert panels and all of this? You're wasting your money. Go back and fix your test first, then go move forward. So I took that attitude at that point. We take the same attitude today. So we did a first qualitative analysis. That was undertaken by Professor Guoxing Yu at Bristol University. He did an excellent job, I think. And he looked at the test completely independently and, told us things that maybe we didn't really want him to tell us and stuff that we were quite pleased with. But he prepared his report, presented it with the report, and essentially told us, yeah, you can probably go on to phase 2. Phase 2 then was test data. And obviously with confidentiality issues around that, we undertook that in-house, as most exam boards would do. So we generated quite a lot of data, over 500 people. We had test data for both. So we were then able to do a quantitative analysis, which actually told us quite a lot. And we learned lessons from doing it ourselves. We learned lessons about our own test. We learned lessons about the Pearson test. So the outcomes essentially were in phase one, Professor Guoxing, you indicated that the tests have very similar target populations and usage. So there was certainly enough evidence to allow us to move on to a next step. However, when he was doing the next step, he found that there were differences in the interpretation of the construct. In some of the areas of the test, the differences weren't massive, to be absolutely honest. There were slightly different interpretations of reading and listening, for example. Probably less so with listening. They were very, very similar in how they operationalized the construct. Both, to be fair, quite traditional in the approach. And both we felt very similar in many kind of ways, as did Professor Yu. The differences really were found in the productive skills, in how both were operationalized. But interestingly enough, when we looked at the numbers, as we'll find later, the differences, it wasn't fully as we expected. But we did find that there were differences in interpretation of construct, and I don't have any problem with that. That's down to different exam boards. For example, I was the person who designed the original aptness test, but that's 10 years ago. If I was asked to do it today, it wouldn't look like it does now. It would look different because my head is different, and I've learned loads more, and I've read loads more. I've listened to people. I've seen tests in action in various countries around the world. So things move on, things change. But we did find that there were enough similarities to allow us to move on to phase two. And I think that's important. And that should be important with any comparability study. You should have that sort of stop-go position, if you know what I mean. You should say, yeah, we can go ahead, or no, this is a waste of time, money, or as I heard once in a business conference, it's a wombat, a waste of money, brains, and time, or something like that, a wombat. So you don't go there. You don't waste your time going on to a phase two. We felt that, yeah, there was enough to go on to a phase two when we looked at the Guoxing Yu's report. So then we looked at the outcomes of phase two. We found that the results were very similar for the overall test scores for the two tests. Very little difference. The Pearson study, which came out a few months before ours, was very similar, within a couple of points in many cases. We would generally say, yeah, to the untrained eye, you'd say these two studies are essentially telling the same story. There's very little difference between them, even though we had two totally different populations. Really interesting to find that. We found that the receptive skills were very similar across the range. It was remarkably similar trajectories across the ranges and very similar movement up through the levels. However, we found that there were particular differences in the productive skills, mostly in terms of speaking, which is probably not a massive surprise because the operationalization of the writing in both the tasks may look slightly different, but they're essentially still tapping into the same skills, or very, very similar skills. So the tasks may look a little bit different, but what they're doing is relatively similar. So we wouldn't expect massive differences in scores, and we didn't get them. We saw little changes here and there, but not major. However, with the speaking, it was seriously significant. There was massive difference, a totally different beast. And that's probably not unusual because of the nature of the Pearson test. It's a tape-mediated, it's a computer-mediated test, automatically scored, whereas the IELTS is face-to-face spoken interaction. So it's testing interaction, and it's also testing production, whereas Pearson is probably looking at production only, which again is a limiting of the construct operationalization, which you may or may not decide is a problem. I did debate on whether to actually go into the details of this project, and I thought, well, at the last minute, I think to demonstrate the absolute difference in the speaking, you have to look at it in this way. We can see that there's a major issue here with the speaking, in that a person taking a Pearson to achieve the equivalent of a 7.5, you're almost at the top of the scale. There's a serious topping out effect there in the speaking, which doesn't exist with the other skills. You know, when you look at them fairly carefully, there is a massive difference. We had a small issue with the titling of that one. That really was the speaking issue. So the lessons that we learned from the study. It's critical to undertake a construct comparison. Absolutely critical. If you don't undertake a construct comparison, you're wasting your time. The numbers may not mean anything. The construct comparison also helps you to interpret the numbers. So when you see the numbers, when you see a similarity or a difference, you can go back into the construct comparison or the qualitative comparison and see what might have caused that, what might be the reason it exists. That's really very, very important in terms of how to interpret the overall results of the study, or in effect, the two studies that come to form a single one. And the other point is you never just compare the overall score, because it's likely to mask issues that are hidden within that overall score. So essentially, the idea would be that you take as many of pieces of data as you can. And if it's reported in 4 skills, then you look at those 4 areas. If it's reported, like some tests are beginning to think about, at least now, looking at the CFR companion volume, you might look at 7. You might look at different areas, and again you would look at each one of them to see where the similarities and differences are. Otherwise, I think you're not really going to understand very much about where you've come from with that test. So in general, we see here, these are genuinely 2 images of mojitos that I downloaded from the web. 2 different recipes. As you can see, they're both called mojitos. They're not the same. So they are seriously different, those 2 mojitos. In fact, the one on the right, I think you'd have some nerve to call it a mojito. I've never in my life even considered a red mojito.
Where does the red come from, Barry?
I have no idea.
Grenadine or something?
Probably grenadine or something, some daft additional ingredient in there, but I have no idea. If you want to find the full report, you'll find it at that, using that QR code. Now, yesterday when I was doing my plenary talk, I left the scanning tool up for too little time, and people didn't have time to reach for their phones. So I'm going to leave it there for about 20 seconds more so that you have time to reach your phone and scan it. If you can't get access to it, I'm sure we can send you in the chat, we can send you the link. It's not a problem, but it's up online. It's not the most beautifully presented report as yet, but we thought it was an important report, so we put it up before it was nicely, beautifully packaged. It will be fairly soon, I'm sure. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll get back to some questions, I hope.
It seems we have more than 5 minutes.
Yes, we've got plenty of time for questions, which is what I'm hoping for.
Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. Yes, we have already a couple of questions and comments. I would like to start by this comment here, asking about the relationship, or well, just commenting on the relationship between what you just said and what was said in the previous presentation. Right. So I would like to know if you have anything to add regarding this comment. This comparison is crucial to the situation highlighted in the previous presentation with the decision makers for college admission.
Yeah, you're talking about Misty's presentation, right? We're looking at how you communicate the meaning of scores on tests to decision makers for entry into university, what the intended purpose of IELTS and other exams that were on that list. Yeah, perhaps we ought to show them, 3 mojitos and get them to realize they're not the same. right? And that some would be okay for their students, and the one, perhaps the one with the vodka is no good for them because it's got the wrong ingredients for what they're trying to achieve at their party. So I think this is an interesting point. How do you get this rather complex message over in a simpler way than we've succeeded in the past? Because at the end of the day, people want these very simple, if you like, representations, like a flat table where everything looks it's as if it's the same because it's listed in the same way. Or, as we heard, if it correlates with something that somebody knows about, then that's okay. If it correlates with TOEFL or whatever it might be, then good, we'll just accept it. So they're not looking at the ingredients before they're reaching the conclusion about the quality of the cocktail.
All right. Well, this is something pretty similar. A question from Ana Maria Hurtado. She says, can IELTS and TOEFL be compared quantitatively and qualitatively? So what about those ingredients there?
Well, Barry, you can answer this because comparisons can always be made, like, even between things which are very different. You can compare French and Basque languages, but you can't reach conclusions about the sameness of them very easily. So this is the issue, I think, Barry. What do you think the answer to this question is?
I'm just posting the link, sorry. I've posted the link. Well, I left out an N, but you know what I mean. I've posted the link to that report in the chat. Yeah, I think we do need to make these kind of comparisons. I think they are important, particularly, and I think Misty made the point earlier in one of her comments that we should really be looking at these tests, even if they are wildly different. We should look at them. We should draw comparisons across them. But our argument is that we may not need to do a full comparison, as in phase 1 and phase 2 of all of these tests, because some of them we can show very, very clearly, or it becomes very obvious, I should say, in an independent review of both, that there is no point in moving on to look at a quantitative analysis. So it's very important, I think, that first step is done independently by an independent researcher. And I think that's a critical part, because then we can honestly say, yes, it's worthwhile moving on to a second stage, or it's not. For me, that's the critical bit. We shouldn't automatically assume that we should be doing both at the same all the time. For me, it doesn't work like that.
And getting people to look at the ingredients and the quality of the ingredients when you're making a recipe, or when you're using it, when you're eating it or tasting it, you see, for in your dinner party. I mean, it's really what we need people to do. And I think I think in Misty's presentation, someone said we use a lingo in language testing, a lingo which people acquire without actually understanding. They take bits of it and use it, but they don't really drill down into the underlying, if you like, meanings of that lingo. So perhaps we need to think of ways like, this Mojito metaphor really is, which Pete was using. It stuck in people's minds, and that's why we've sort of awakened it here, because it makes people think about what it is they're trying to compare, right? And what it does is try and get away from the idea that if it looks the same, it is the same, or if someone just tells you it's got the similar ingredients, it's going to be all right. The decision makers need to understand, how do we get the message over? That's the question.
Yeah, and I think we need to understand how to communicate more effectively with decision makers as well. We need to understand that if we're going to work with decision makers to help them interpret what tests are about and what the test scores might mean and what they could and could not be used for, we have to learn to speak to them in their own backyard, if you like. We have to go to their conferences, we have to go to their meetings, talk to them in their way, not in
their context, right?
The other issue we have, of course, with all of this is that there isn't just a single language. Like, language testing is kind of multilingual in many ways in terms of the lingo, because the lingo that's used often in Europe and in the United States, sometimes you have the same words, but it's a completely different interpretation of what that word means. Now, I just finished a long project, was it last year or the year before, with a book that I wrote with Micheline Chalub-Deville on validity. And, we thought, having discussed this at conferences, why don't we write a book about it? Because there are definitely different interpretations of it. But what we hadn't realized until we started to work on the book and started to disagree with each other about almost everything is that a lot of the concepts and a lot of the thinking on the different sides of the Atlantic were completely different. So when I talked about construct and when she talked about construct, we were talking about two different things. And we didn't realize how different they were until we actually met up and almost came to blows, I think, at one stage. And then realized...
I might say you have a different stance on the fundamental issues, you see. Different worldview coming at it, which I think this is sort of in a more constructivist way. You'd want to reveal that when you're talking to people. What do you already understand? How do you see this? In order then to have a conversation using words which are going to be helpful in bridging a gap between what I'm thinking and doing and what you're thinking and doing, which may be going in parallel tracks. That is really challenging when you come from different parts of the world, for example.
Yes.
You think differently.
And it's a complicated message to try to get across. And rather than complicate it even more by using jargon and our own lingo to describe it and to define it to people, we need to find other ways to communicate. We need to be able to communicate, to talk to people in their own language, in their own way, and not in our way. That, for me, that's the critical bit. It all comes down to communication.
And you can't just use simple metaphors because, as I said, some people prefer mojitos to margaritas, and some people do like to put grenadine in their margaritas, or their mojitos. So whatever you're using, you have to think about where differences are well grounded in people's different approaches and their preferences, right? There is no right way of doing it. And so, the tradition of IELTS for face-to-face speaking and productive skills in writing is a stance which makes comparison difficult when another exam body takes a different view. So perhaps with less interactive constructs or a different way of rating a productive skill like writing. So the nature of the beast makes comparisons different, but the exam providers deliberately bake those differences in because they have a worldview, a stance, a preference, which they think has better impact in other ways, and not just on decisions for, shall we say, entry to the university. What about impact on learning or on policy thinking and so forth?
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for such an interesting discussion, as well for the one that is unfolding here in the chat box. But unfortunately, we didn't have more time.
Thanks for the comments. Very good.
Yes, we still have a couple of interesting questions from Anna Góngora, Richard Spivey, and other of our speakers. But sadly, we don't have any more time now because we need to go to a short break. All right. So thank you so much, Barry and Nick, for such an interesting presentation, for those great answers. And well, we hope to see you in another opportunity.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you very much to everybody else who listened patiently to us as we
you can froth off your mojito now if it's the right time of day.
Yeah, we're getting close to mojito time. Cheers, folks.
Yeah, very nice talking to you all. Yeah, lovely. See you soon.